Good evening. My name is Bill Barabalt. I'm the president of the Richard Nixon Foundation, and I'm pleased to welcome you and a friend of the foundation's, Geoff Shepard. When I first took this position, Geoff's name was often identified as a person very active with the foundation, and soon I found that he was organizing reunions going back to the domestic policy group within the Nixon administration. That later he had developed a number of legacy forums that were held across the United States that presented policies and achievements of the administration. And then I heard he was writing a book. And when I finally met Geoff, he became a good friend. I now understand all the contributions he's made to the foundation, and in particular, the Nixon legacy. And the book that he was writing is finally here. So we're very pleased to give him this opportunity. It's his first stop. The book came out on Monday, so we're honored to have him here for the Real Scandal, Geoff Shepard.
You take this with you. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill. It's an honor to be here, an honor to have Bill as our new head of the Richard Nixon Foundation. As it turns out, the Real Watergate Scandal is the trashing of our Constitution and Bill of Rights in the successful effort to drive President Nixon from office, to imprison his senior aides, and to realign political power without the inconvenience of an election. We're going to get to that in a couple minutes, but I want to start by telling you why I think I'm in good shape to write this book and why you may think or may conclude that perhaps I know what I'm talking about. I'm a California native, like many of you. Went to Long Beach Wilson High School and then to Whittier College. And I think of myself back then as normal. And then something changed for me. I got a scholarship to Harvard Law School. And I did well, coming from the uncultured West Coast. And I graduated with honors. And then I was chosen to be a White House Fellow directly out of Harvard Law School. So at the tender age of 24, I joined President Nixon's staff at the White House. And after my fellowship year, that's a program where they bring in about 15 young people to study the federal government for a year. And I did that. And then I joined the Domestic Council at the White House staff. It was run by John Ehrlichman. The Domestic Council staffs the president on domestic issues. It's the counterpart of the National Security Council. And I was there for 5 years. I ended up as associate director of the Domestic Council. My main assignment was the Department of Justice. So I worked with and knew everybody involved in Watergate. I liked some, I didn't like some, but I knew them on a personal basis. These were not names in a newspaper. And things were going quite well. And then Watergate hit. And as the tide of Watergate rose, I did something that is somewhat similar to what Clark Gable does in the end of Gone with the Wind, when he runs off to join the Confederacy when all seems lost. And what I did was demand a seat at the defense table for President Nixon. I believed then, and I believe now, that we were about to lose a president because of inadequate legal representation. And so I demanded a seat at the table, and I became the principal deputy to the president's lead Watergate defense counsel, Fred Bizart. I transcribed the tapes, I ran the document rooms that held the seized files, and I briefed the senior staff, and I staffed the presidential counselors who were the spokespeople on Watergate, Bryce Harlow and Dean Burch. You may remember it ended rather badly. It's not just I lost my first case, but we lost a president. And I left rather bitter about the whole experience. And maybe you remember the mantra during that era. It was no man is above the law. And that's true. But about 12 years ago, I decided I'd go back and have another look and see what led to and how Watergate unfolded. And I discovered something that I hadn't realized before, and that's that the special prosecutors, being government employees, their files are kept even today at the National Archives. Now, it's a little hard to get into them. It takes some time. You have to put in FOIA requests, and you have to know what you're looking for. But if you persevere, you can read the documents of the opposition. And this is something like discovering 30 years after you lost the championship football game that you can have access to the coach's playbook from the other side. And you can see what they were doing to exploit your weaknesses and what you were doing to exploit theirs and to defend yourself. And as I started reading these documents, a pattern appeared. And the pattern is what forms the basis of the book, the Real Watergate Scandal, because there are documentation of flagrant violations of due process and cheating. There's really no other word for it. They cheated to get to Richard Nixon and to imprison his top aides. No man is against the law, but these people were the law. They were brought in to clean up the Watergate mess, and there was nobody reviewing their work, so they twisted it and they tortured it to suit their own purposes. It's an age-old problem. Who will protect us from our protectors? The judges and the prosecutors were brought in to clean up the Watergate mess. There was a Watergate mess. There was a break-in and there was a cover-up. But they were highly political. And they twisted it around to absorb political power. And that's what I've uncovered. That's what's in the book. And that's what the scandal is. Now, why is it coming out now? I mean, Watergate's an old topic. It's 40 years old. Well, what happened is that 3 of the lead prosecutors took their files with them. Now, this is not unlike having your own private server and deciding later what emails you're going to turn over and what you're going to destroy. Because like those emails, these are government documents and they should have been preserved for researchers. And what happened by taking the documents, there was a sort of cover-up. You couldn't get certain documents. They filled out their careers, legal careers, distinguished legal careers, gave their papers to their alma mater, which is the appropriate thing to do. And the alma mater sorted through them, decided what they were going to make available. And they only became available in the last couple of years. I'm not the first person to go through the papers, but I'm the first person to realize what's there. And what's there is documented proof of collusion between the prosecutors and the judges. You don't have to watch too much crime on TV to understand that judges aren't supposed to get together with one side without the other side being present. These are called ex parte meetings, and they're strictly forbidden in the concepts of fair trial. But that's what happened in the Watergate scandal. Let me give you a quick overview of what's going to show up in the book. Much of what you've been told about Watergate turns out to be untrue. President Nixon was driven from office largely. They're everywhere. That was unplanned. Forgive me. I have to figure out how I did that and make sure I don't do that again. Where were we, class? President Nixon was driven from office largely by false representations of highly partisan Democratic prosecutors. President Nixon's aides were denied any semblance of a fair trial. In short, the fix was in, the dice were loaded, the deck was stacked. I remember these meetings. Now, I'm in my 20s. I'm not in charge, but I'm a key member of the defense team, and I'm in the room when this stuff is going on. And we'd have these meetings with the judge, and the other side was always prepared, always confident, always ready to respond. And we were always caught by surprise by his questions. And now we know why. they were getting together in advance to work it out, which you're not supposed to do. Let's remind ourselves of who the players were. These are the top 6. The folks across the bottom row, Gordon Liddy, Jeb Magruder, and John Dean, are the ones who committed the crimes. Gordon Liddy masterminded the break-in into the Watergate Hotel. Jeb Magruder was his boss. He's the one who authorized it. And John Dean ran the cover-up. In his own words, he was the chief desk officer for the cover-up. The gentlemen across the top are their supervisors, Nixon's top aides, John Mitchell, Bob Haldeman, and John Ehrlichman. Now, they're the ones who are convicted in the Watergate cover-up trial, convicted on all counts. But the question has always been, in the minds of people who aren't really sure we got the true story, whether the folks at the bottom were operating under the direction and control of the folks at the top. Now, you go back a little bit further. I've outlined 4 of these people in a red box. And they're outlined because they were present. They were the only people present at 2 key meetings that took place in John Mitchell's office where they discussed Gordon Liddy's intelligence plan. Now, they didn't approve it at those meetings, but they discussed it. They reviewed it. And so you can see how after the break-in arrests where these people are arrested, these 4 people might believe they were at risk of prosecution because they knew what was started, what was under consideration. Again, it wasn't approved, but it was under consideration. And they reacted in different ways. Gordon Liddy told John Dean, it was my team, it's my fault, and then he clammed up and wouldn't testify and wouldn't talk and wouldn't take the stand in the trials. Jeb Magruder decided that it would be better to lie and start a cover-up, and he lied in his grand jury appearances. John Dean ran the cover-up. As I say, he, in his own words, he became chief desk officer. John Mitchell got out of town. He resigned as head of the re-election committee within 10 days of the break-in. Now, we thought it was because of his alcoholic wife, Martha. But it turns out that wasn't entirely the case. Well, what about the other 2 people? What about Bob Haldeman and John Ehrlichman? And what about the president? In the intervening 40 years since the Watergate story broke, it's never been shown that they knew about the break-in in advance or had any concept of Gordon Liddy's campaign intelligence plan. So why would they have a reason to cover up? They had a reason to protect the president politically, no problem. But they had no reason to cover up. And what they did, this is the mistake of the century, they sent their lawyer, John Dean, to protect the White House interests. The people at CREEP who had done the break-in, they were hopelessly lost. There's no question about that. But there was going to be a line of demarcation between the committee, where crazy things might happen, and the White House itself. And John Dean's job was to see to that. But you see, Dean was at risk of prosecution himself. So he cast his lot with the people at the committee to re-elect. And he engaged in criminal conduct over and above just obstruction of justice. He rehearsed Jeb Magruder for his perjured testimony before 2 grand juries. He learned and then passed along to defense counsel the prosecution's analysis and concept of where they were going, which is totally improper. He destroyed evidence taken from Howard Hunt's safe. And he's the only person in Watergate who embezzled money. John Dean embezzled campaign funds. He took $4,000 of campaign funds to fund his honeymoon. So then you have this cover-up, and the cover-up collapses. We're not really good at breaking the law. The cover-up collapses, and John Dean's running it so he knows, and he's the first to run to the prosecutors. And he says, look, I can give you Magruder and Mitchell. And the career prosecutors, the first team, says, we got them. We don't need you. And he discusses it with his lawyer, and he does two things. One, he takes documents that he possessed as the president's lawyer, having nothing to do with Watergate, and shared them with the prosecutors as kind of a down payment on his immunity. Now, they wouldn't give him immunity, but he took what we could say were the family secrets, the things we didn't really want to have out, and gave them to the prosecutors to try to buy immunity. And that didn't work. And then if you look at his book, there's a moment in his book where his lawyer, and this is a book written by John Dean, where his lawyer says, they think you're guilty. You're in real trouble. You better start talking cover-up to make yourself an invaluable witness. And he says, a couple paragraphs later in his own book, I really like this cover-up idea. And while there's no direct proof that he was operating under direction and control of Haldeman and Ehrlichman, he was the only path. So you have this key government witness who changes his story in the hands of the prosecutors. During the course of the interviews, he goes from the guys who did the crimes to accusing his superiors. Now, you may not all be lawyers, and I feel badly for you, or actually feel good for you. One of the absolute requirements of the prosecution is if a witness changes his testimony in the course of talking to you, you must disclose that to the defense counsel. And they didn't do it. And the book will go into it in great detail, the documentation of his change of story, which they hid. So those are the players. Watergate cover-up failed, and people ran for cover, and there were resignations, and two people moved to the fore, and they're on the next slide. And you may not be able to tell, but on your left is Elliot Richardson, and he was named Attorney General, and Archibald Cox, who becomes the first special prosecutor appointed just for Watergate. Elliot Richardson is named as Attorney General because he's not involved at all in Watergate. He's clean, he should be easily confirmed. But it turns out he was a very poor choice. He dreamed someday of running for president himself, and he wanted nothing to do with Watergate, because to make a decision was to get involved in a controversy that could inhibit his own political dreams. So he didn't want to be Attorney General. Nixon importuned him, but Elliot didn't want to be there. So he became what I will describe as the Pontius Pilate of Watergate. He left the field of battle. But before leaving, he was more than happy to turn the investigation over to Archibald Cox. He had been his professor at Harvard Law School, and he was Senator Kennedy's choice to be special prosecutor. And there's a reason why, as it develops. Archibald Cox was the Triple Crown winner of the Kennedy political dynasty. He'd been staff aide to Jack Kennedy since 1953. He toured with him on the 1960 presidential campaign. He ran the Academic Brain Trust for President Kennedy. And in the Kennedy administration, he was named Solicitor General at the Department of Justice. That's the number 3 position. And make no mistake about it, he was a superb Attorney General. But he was from the previous administration. And even when that was over, he was working with Senator Ted Kennedy and helping to staff the senator on his opposition to President Nixon's Supreme Court appointments. And so what you have is the very heart of the opposition becoming head of the group that's going to investigate the presidency. And Elliot did 2 other things. He not only gave full and unreviewed independence to the special prosecutor, but that included the power to investigate both sides. So you had this juxtaposition of them being able to investigate us, but us, the duly elected administration, had no power to investigate them. And they announced at their first press conference they had the intent of investigating every single allegation ever made against the Nixon administration. So this was not a happy development, and it got worse. I know you can't read this chart, but I love it. It's reproduced in the back of the book, but not in glorious color. This is the Kennedy-Johnson Department of Justice. And all you need to understand is there are 17 names in red because they joined the special prosecutor's office. You see, they only hired their friends, and by some fluke, their friends all turned out to be partisan Democrats who'd worked in the previous administration. So the top 17 lawyers in this supposedly independent and nonpartisan investigation had all worked together before. Now, a couple of them were nominal Republicans, and the press made a huge thing about this, but they were safe Republicans. They already knew them. They'd already worked with them. And what you have, if you're cynical, and I have become somewhat cynical, you have the previous administration's Department of Justice having wrest prosecutorial power against you, and you can't investigate them. And these were very good lawyers. Don't misunderstand. I'm not criticizing their ability. I'm criticizing their objectivity. So here, in the next picture, this is a group shot of the special prosecutor's office. This is on the courthouse steps. It's a big group. It grew to be 100 people. Okay? Now, only 60, counting turnover, were lawyers. But this doesn't count the IRS and the FBI investigators they could harness. Again, we can't harness any of them because they've got the investigatory responsibility. I would submit to you that no institution, no business, no charity, certainly no White House, could withstand a determined inquiry by their opponents without budget or time constraints. This is, if you'll forgive the analogy, this is like having 100 mothers-in-law who don't like you. And they're going through everything you have. They want your old love letters. They want your bank accounts. They want everything that you have. And you've got no place to hide. You have no way to defend yourself. So as you might imagine, I get some water at this point. Yes, I'm going to have to duck soon. And I didn't drop the microphone. So as you might imagine, the White House screamed foul. Ron Ziegler, the president's press secretary, said, well, these are zealots. These are people out to get us. And so what the special prosecutor decided to do was to write a public letter back to Ziegler saying, this is bad form. You shouldn't attack us. We're just honest, forthright citizens. And I'm going to read you the key paragraph in that letter. And this was signed by Leon Jaworski, the new special prosecutor who replaced Archibald Cox. When I first assumed this task, I'd been forewarned, based on rumor to be sure, that there were those in the special prosecutor's office who were zealots, determined to achieve their own end regardless of truth. I'm now prepared to assure you, after a month of close association with the staff, this suspicion is totally unfounded. I've worked daily with my principal subordinates, reviewing data being assembled, additional sources to explore, recommendations to consider, and action to be taken. In my experience at the bar, I found no group who as a whole are more objective, more fair-minded, and more dedicated to a search for truth than this unusual group of talented lawyers. Should I find any among them who do not meet these qualifications of fairness and objectivity, I would not hesitate to dismiss them. Now, we call this praise. This is high praise for a group of talented people. But it turns out Leon Jaworski didn't draft this letter. He'd only been there a month. This was drafted for him by the staff. And it turns out to be kind of a litmus test. Buddy, you're new. Are you with us or are you with our opponents? Now, we tried to do that to Bill Barabolt when he took over the foundation, but he wouldn't play. So this is the public is assured this is all on the up and up. Okay? Now, we ask ourselves, what did Leon Jaworski really think about this staff that was assembled by Archibald Cox and these other two other Harvard law professors? What did he really think? Well, I happen to find a document in the files that helps us. This is the end of an exchange of 4 letters between Leon Jaworski and his deputy, Hank Ruth. And I'm only taking 1 paragraph out of it, but it's key. So this is how he concludes the memo. Now let me address myself to the general tenor of your memorandum, which reflects an attitude I've discussed with you before. The subjective conviction that the president must be reached at all costs. Now, it's not in italics, you understand, in the memo. I just wanted to be sure you didn't miss that phrase. It's also reflected in your references to St. Clair's letter. St. Clair was a president's defense lawyer. He stated nothing that you should not expect in all fairness. What is of some concern to me are the discussions, plans, and understandings had and reached between staff members prior to any discussion with me. This results in convictions already being formed. And frankly, under these circumstances, the meetings are of no use to me. It's not even worth it for me to meet with my staff because you've had pre-meetings and you've all gotten together to decide what you're going to tell me. I'm not getting opinions, I'm getting conclusions that are all uniform. The stubborn fact remains that we must be alert not to give support to White House charges that have been leveled against the staff. Perhaps it is too late to get objective opinions from others. So I'll do the best I can making the decisions for which I, not the staff, will be held responsible. Now, you couldn't find a clearer denunciation of the lack of objectivity of his staff. And I'm not making this stuff up. This is his own memo. Now, we didn't know about this. This is one of the memos that he took with him when he left. So the public is told, reassured, and the media jumps on, reassured this is totally objective, all they're after is a search for the truth, when their own leader confirms, in I think the most dramatic language, I couldn't have drafted better language, of what's really going on. It is a bunch of zealots. They are out to get the president and his top aides. So what did they do? This is just the veneer on the top of what's going on. Well, there was something else going on behind the curtain. And I try to illustrate it in this slide. This is Judge Sirica in the center. He was the trial judge. And it says Sirica's secret meetings, and the bottom says ex parte. That's the Latin way you say secret meetings. And these are 6 of the people that he met with before and during the course of Watergate trials. 3 of them, center bottom, Earl Silbert, next to the left, Archibald Cox, and up the top, Leon Jaworski, are all special prosecutors. The other 3 are interested parties with interests that are adverse to the Nixon administration. On your left is Sam Dash, chief counsel of the Irvin Committee. He's not supposed to be meeting with the judge. On your upper right is Edward Bennett Williams. He's public enemy number 1 for the Nixon White House. He's counsel to the Democratic National Committee that's suing them for the break-in. And he's counsel to the Washington Post, whose articles are ripping them from side to side. But he happens to be a close friend of Judge Sirica. Now, they'll tell you, if they come out to fight, they'll tell you that Judge Sirica was appointed by President Eisenhower, so he's a Republican. They won't tell you that Edward Bennett Williams was his career mentor, that both Mr. Williams and his wife were godparents to Sirica's daughter, or that Sirica was so close to him he wouldn't allow Williams to argue cases in front of him as judge because they were so tight. But Edward Bennett Williams can go meet with him secretly to work out problems. And the final is a gentleman you don't know named Clark Molinoff. He was an investigative reporter before Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And he's an interesting case. He convinced President Nixon that what the incoming administration needed was an ombudsman, a reporter, an investigative reporter who could smell out scandal before it blew up in their face. And why not someone who didn't like him, who could be there and warn him? And Nixon hired him. and he became special counsel to the president. But then President Nixon tired of him because Clark had so many opinions on so many things that didn't have anything to do with those topics. And he got frozen out, and he didn't get to see the president as often as Clark thought he should. And he blamed John Ehrlichman and Bob Haldeman for cutting off his access. And he leaves in a huff 10 months later. He goes back to reporting, and he becomes the fiercest critic of the Nixon White House. He happened to be a close friend of Judge Sirica. So as Watergate starts to unwind, this man with the color of inside information goes and meets with Sirica to tell him how he thought things had come down. Now, this is classic violation of due process. If you happen to find yourself in court and you happen to be accused of some crime, your accuser has to come into court and face you under oath. They don't get to whisper in the judge's ear on the side. I mean, that's kind of what the Sixth Amendment says. But that's not what Clark Molinoff did. Clark Molinoff met with a judge on the side to convince him to do certain things. So the book details all of these secret meetings. Then we say, okay, the fix was in. What did they do to President Nixon, and what did they do to his top aides? Now, you've got to remember, President Nixon never came to trial, so they have to be divided in how you handle them. Here's what the documents show they did to President Nixon. Remember, in Jaworski's memo, he says this effort to reach Nixon at all cost. Well, the prosecutors secretly assured the court and the Congress that Nixon had personally ordered payment of Howard Hunt's blackmail demands. They secretly assured the grand jurors, and the grand jurors promptly named Nixon in their indictment as a co-conspirator. They secretly assured the staff of the House Judiciary Committee, and they promptly recommended that Nixon be impeached. Now, we didn't know they were saying this because they did it in secret, so we couldn't rebut it. And you only learn about it if you go into the documents and you see the documents and you see what they were prepared to say to the grand jury and what they did say to the House Judiciary Committee staff. The difficulty is that, in fact, President Nixon did no such thing. And when these people went to prove it, now remember, Nixon is not on trial in the cover-up trial. He's already resigned. But this was their only effort to get him, so they sought to prove this theory in the cover-up trial. And as you get into the book, The Real Watergate Scandal, it documents how their own witnesses wouldn't go that way. And the words out of their own witnesses' mouths unproved this allegation. But we didn't know about the allegation. You didn't know about the allegation because it was rendered in secret. So they just traipsed right on off. They'd successfully driven him from office, and we're none the wiser. So that's what they did to our president. What did they do to the staff? Now remember, the president's resigned. The trial starts in October after the August resignation. This weekend is the anniversary of the resignation. The cover-up trial starts in October. But the prosecutors know they need convictions, because if somebody by some fluke gets acquitted, then there will be questions about what was going on. But if they can say, nah, everybody was convicted, and these guys were convicted on all counts, then it stops criticism. It certainly bottled me up until a couple of years ago. So here's what they did to the staff. First, you'll like these phrases, the fix was in. Prosecutors met in secret with a judge to work out issues and procedures in advance of trial. Absolute no-no. If any hint of this had come out, the judge would have been off that case so fast it'd make your head spin. If it came out shortly after they were convicted, convictions would have been thrown out. There may have been another trial, but the convictions would have been thrown out. The dice were loaded. Now, any trial lawyer will tell you that a jury trial is a roll of the dice. You don't know what the jury might do. But this jury had loaded dice. It was both tainted by the massive pretrial publicity on Watergate, and it was politically biased. The District of Columbia is a very unique jurisdiction. The voter pool, the registered voters, which is where the jury pool is drawn from, consistently returns 80% Democratic majorities in office. You can't take a group from there in a prominent Republican case and expect a fair trial. But that's what they did. They fought and they agreed with the judge how to do that. And finally, the deck was stacked. This borders on incredulity. The chief prosecutor, head prosecutor, met with the chief judge of the appellate panel and explained how to stack the deck on the appeal so that liberal control would be maintained. You must understand that Judge Sirica was the most reversed judge in the D.C. Circuit before Watergate. And he was reversed because he didn't seem to pay attention to defendants' rights. Archibald Cox became concerned that Sirica would blow it at trial because he was so eager to secure convictions. Archibald Cox was right. So he went to the appellate court and said, I tell you how we can avoid him getting reversed. You need to maintain liberal control on the appeals. Now, you got to read the book to see how that was done. But that's nothing short of incredible. Nothing short of the corruption, the collusion wasn't just at trial. It went to the appellate court. So what do we know? Well, this is where we started. Much of what you've been told about Watergate's untrue. President Nixon was driven from office by false representations of highly partisan Democratic prosecutors who colluded with both trial and appellate judges. Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, John Mitchell were denied any semblance of a fair trial. The fix was in, the dice were loaded, the deck was stacked. So what? You know, it's 40 years, so they cheated. This is Hillary's question on Benghazi. What difference at this point does it make? Well, I will tell you what difference it makes. Thank you. I will tell you what difference it makes. They cheated, they got red-handed, and there have to be consequences. And that's what the book starts. There have to be consequences because those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And this applies to liberals and conservatives alike because if it was done to Republicans in a time of intense political conflict, if our Bill of Rights could not withstand political pressure, it could be done to Democrats next time out. If the rules don't apply to some, then they don't apply to all. The theory of a fair trial, most Americans will tell you that even the most despised criminal deserves a fair trial. We give them a fair trial and then we hang them. It's very, very simple. But they get a fair trial. And these people were consistently denied a fair trial. So what do we want? Well, we want the cover-up verdicts to be vacated. They're hopelessly tainted. And that shouldn't be that hard, not after my book has come out. And the second thing, we want the truth. Let's get the truth out about Watergate. Now, I went to Whittier College, Dick and I together, and Hubert, 30 years apart. If you go in the main administration building, there's a quote from John Greenleaf Whittier carved into the mantle. Early hath life's mighty question thrilled within thy heart of youth, with a deep and strong beseeching, what and where is truth? And that's what we're asking for, the truth about Watergate. Now, Harvard also, their slogan is truth. It being Harvard, it's put in Latin. It's veritas. But we should join together in this search of truth. And what does it mean? Well, there's documents still to come out. The Irvin Committee and the House Judiciary Committee sealed all of their reports. It's what you do in an investigation. Because you don't want to ruin reputations of innocent people. So they seal the records for 50 years. Well, I'm not going to be around when these things get unsealed, and we'd like them unsealed now so people who know what they're doing can look through and see, was the special prosecutor really giving grand jury information to the House Judiciary Committee? Was the special prosecutor feeding questions to the Irvin Committee. We deserve to know that. Secondly, perhaps more importantly, we need a judicial investigation. It's the reputation of the D.C. courts that's so besmirched. John Sirica is a disgrace to the federal judiciary. The book documents corruption and collusion within the court. The court should be asked to investigate and clean up its own mess. There are people still around who were involved in those ex parte meetings. They should be called to account under oath to discuss what happened. Now when Ted Stevens was falsely convicted, not all that long ago, the lead witness changed his testimony in the course of the hands of the prosecutors. The FBI, after he was convicted, an FBI agent blew the whistle. The court looked into it, and the court appointed its own special investigator, and he issued a 300-page report just ripping the Department of Justice apart for the way they cheated in convicting Ted Stevens. Now, they couldn't give him back his Senate seat. We can't give President Nixon back his presidency. But the court should be called upon to launch this investigation. And finally, the grand jury transcripts. The grand jury transcripts are sealed, but there are exceptions. They're sealed forever. But there are exceptions for historic purposes. And if you look back, and I have, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg's testimony was unsealed. Alger Hiss's testimony was unsealed by order of the court. Richard Nixon's grand jury testimony was unsealed for historic purposes by order of the court. The court should unseal the Watergate grand jury testimony. We should learn. I tell you the documents suggest what they said, but what they said is on record. It's at National Archives. I can't get to it, but the court can. The court can unseal. How did they convince the grand jury to name Nixon as a co-conspirator? There's a news article from one grand juror saying they took a straw vote. You aren't supposed to have straw votes. Same juror told the newspaper a prosecutor was in the room when they took the vote. You can't do that. There's a lot of grand jury abuse that's covered up because it stays sealed forever. Let's unseal the grand jury transcripts and see what they did to our president and to our people. And finally, and I warned my close friends, then America owes Richard Nixon an apology. Okay? I'm willing, I was there. They will say, well, you're just a Nixon apologist. But that's not true. It's Nixon who should be apologized to. I'm willing to debate anywhere, anytime, the stuff that's in my book. Let's see if somebody wants to come out and defend the indefensible. So that's where we are. What should you do? Okay? Well, I'd like you to read the book. It would be nice if you bought it, but you can borrow it. You can read the book. Don't just put it on the shelf. There's all kinds of things in that book. And you can go on my website, which is shown up here, geoffshepard.com, and there's other essays about Watergate. There's other news about the book. At some point, not too far in the future, I've discovered additional information, and I'll post it on my website. Discuss this with your friends. Don't let this go away. Tell your kids. It's not hard to understand what I've put in that book. If you know any lawyers, and there's lots of us around, ask them about what I've disclosed. I don't think you'll find even liberal lawyers coming out and say, oh, that's harmless error, don't worry about a thing. He was guilty anyway. That's not our system. Our system is come into court, prove your case. We have rules of evidence, we have right of cross-examination. Let's go see. When they tried it, they couldn't do it. You've been very kind. I appreciate your coming. I thank you. I think I have time for some questions before we go to sign books.
Thank you, Geoff. We have our first question on your center left.
Thank you very much. An enlightening lecture tonight. I'm a member of the media, but I'm also a volunteer docent here at the Nixon Library. And I want to know what your thoughts are on the special prosecutor law. It was disposed of in 1999 after the Clinton follies, and I want to know what you think about it being an answer to some of these really tough questions that we have, legal
Sure,
questions,
sure.
with respect to corruption and government.
I have three thoughts, which aren't necessarily consistent. Lawyers always answer in thirds. The special prosecutor law, which was enacted as a Watergate reform after Nixon. Nixon's was a special prosecutor. This is the independent prosecutor law. It was great fun when used against Republicans. But when it was used against President Clinton under Ken Starr, it turned out not to be so much fun, and it was quietly allowed to expire. So you don't have one today. I happen to think it's unconstitutional. It is a gift of the prosecutorial power. And Article 2 says the president is responsible that the laws be faithfully executed. And it doesn't have an asterisk that says, except for criminal investigations of his administration. There is a right to impeach.
Do you have any questions?
The Supreme Court has ruled the other way. There's this delightful case called Morrison v. Olson, where Ted Olson, you may know him, he was Solicitor General, our Solicitor General, and there was an independent prosecutor appointed, and Ted said, unconstitutional, you can't ask me questions. And the circuit court, it's going to take a minute, so just keep calm. We'll get to you. The circuit court said, you're right, it's an unconstitutional delegation. Brilliant opinion. And it was appealed to the Supreme Court, and they ruled 7-1 against. And Bill Rehnquist, my Bill Rehnquist, wrote the opinion. And he said it's not much of an intrusion into the president's powers. I happened to run into Justice Scalia, and I'd worked with him when I was on the White House staff, shortly after that decision. And I went up to him and I said, not entirely tongue-in-cheek, I'm really disappointed in the decision. And he said, I dissented, Geoff. And I said, yes, but Nino, we didn't put you on the court for your vote alone. We put you on the court because you were supposed to influence other justices. He was not amused. He sat down. But in an interview not 5 years ago, he was asked about what case in his entire career on the Supreme Court was he most disappointed in. And he said, it's this very obscure case called Morrison v. Olson, because I think it was so wrongly decided. Well, I think if the court had known what's in my book, what's in the Real Watergate Scandal, the decision wouldn't come down the way it was. So I would love to have an independent prosecutor investigate Democrats, any Democrats, But it's no fair. Imagine what we'd uncover. But it's really unconstitutional. It shouldn't be done. You could appoint a dedicated prosecutor under the rules of the Department of Justice, not one with total and unreviewed independence. See, that was the key to the special prosecutor that did us in and to the independent prosecutor statute. The Attorney General could say, I'm too close to do a fair investigation. I'm going to bring somebody in, but he's still going to report within the Department of Justice. So I think I've answered all around your question for you. Over here.
Thanks, Geoff. It's a great book, great lecture here. You had high praise for Earl Silbert in your book.
I do.
And so I have a question that comes kind of from that particular angle. Let's assume that all of the prosecutors were Earl Silbert quality, Earl Silbert ethical quality. Let's assume all the judges up and down were Earl Silbert quality. Let's assume that the House Judiciary Committee was Earl Silbert quality and that there was no resignation, no pardon. What charges, if any, against President Nixon do you think could have gotten through impeachment and possibly conviction, indictment, possibly conviction, again, assuming an Earl Silbert quality situation?
Well, let's help you with Earl Silbert for just a second. Earl Silbert is the principal assistant U.S. attorney in the District of Columbia. He's a career prosecutor, graduate of Harvard Law School, long-term employee of the Department of Justice, and he's over trying cases, prosecuting. He and his team, there were two others, did the original investigation of the Watergate break-in, and they broke the cover-up. And they got promptly fired in lieu of the special prosecutor who was brought in by the Democrats. So their reward for breaking the cover-up, and I mean, these are good prosecutors, and they followed the case right down the line. And I count Earl as a close friend. I just think he's one of the very few unsung heroes of Watergate. Well, what if everybody had been objective? What if there were no politics? Well, good luck. What if there were no politics in your family? What if there were no politics in your company? We're human beings. Politics is part of the warp and woof. What if we got a fair trial? Okay, I mean, I could go there. And the answer, then we divide them. You asked about Nixon. I want to talk about those convicted in an actual trial. A fair trial would have been held outside of the District of Columbia. You'd move it to Richmond or to Baltimore, and you'd get a fairer trial. You'd get a different makeup of the jury. You would not have Judge Sirica. And you have to understand the District of Columbia is this diamond 10 miles on a side. You're no place in the district where you can't walk 5 miles and cross the state line, but you also cross into the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which was a much more conservative court of appeals, so you would have gotten a fair judge, you would have gotten a fair shot at appeal. Now, it comes down to John Dean's word against these other guys. And of course, the defense would have learned he changed his testimony. I don't know if under those bases, whether they would all have been convicted on all counts, or whether one or more of them would have been acquitted. But this is like a sports game where somebody cheated. You don't say, well, we're going to leave it in the record books because we think they would have won anyway. You throw it out because once cheating has been shown, that's it. You don't inquire further. It's the same thing with the courts. There would have been retrials if they were alive. They're dead. The only response is those verdicts have to be vacated. Now, quickly to President Nixon, you get down to the tapes. And I didn't talk about the tapes because you can get lost in the tapes. I transcribed a whole lot of the tapes. They're ambiguous. If you will forgive the analogy, and I'm careful about using this, they're like the Bible. You can take something out of the Bible and prove whatever you want to prove. Watergate was a serious problem, and it grows, and there are discussions on the tapes. There's clearly an effort to protect themselves politically. At what point does fighting to protect yourself politically slop over into obstruction of justice? Now, if you go in the book, obstruction of justice is a thought crime. Perjury is a thought crime. Conspiracy is a thought crime. Well, what's a thought crime? It requires the jury to get inside your mind to find guilt. If the jury doesn't happen to like you, that becomes pretty easy. But it's almost impossible to defend yourself against those kinds of charges in an adverse jury group. So take President Nixon. He doesn't control the House. Both the House and the Senate are about 2/3 Democratic, but lots of the people in the House are Southern Democrats, and they're conservative, and they happen to be committee chairmen, so he's got a fair shot. Jerry Ziefman, who wrote one of the early books, Without Honor, The Crimes of Camelot and the Impeachment of Richard Nixon, maintains that if Manny Sellers, a very renowned congressman from New York, had still been head of judiciary, this never would have gotten off the ground. It was only Rodino who was new and didn't control his committee. There was a very close question on whether they were really going to recommend impeachment, even under the circumstances. I maintain, and it's not the time to go into it, but I maintain there's nothing on the tapes that's unambiguous that shows Nixon knew. I don't like to cite John Dean's book, but it came out last year, and he says, look, there's hints, but Nixon didn't understand the problem until I went in on March 21st and told him what was going on. And even when he first approached the prosecutors, Dean comes in and says, I tried to tell him on March 21st and he didn't get it. So I think you can make a strong case that Nixon's he's trying to figure stuff out, and other stuff he doesn't want to figure out. He doesn't want to go there. He's running the country. But I don't think he knew what was going on until he was told about the blackmail, and then I believe his answer to the blackmail, and I think it's in the tapes, other people read the words differently, that he says, the way to beat Hunt is us to disclose this first, then he can't blackmail us. And he tells his staff that very evening, you're going in front of the Irvin Committee and I'm not going to claim executive privilege. Now, if that had happened, if John Dean hadn't run off, if he hadn't switched sides, Watergate wouldn't have been an issue. Beyond that, we don't know. I mean, we can't replay the sports. I think you talk about reasonable doubt, which is the hallmark of our system. There were acres of reasonable doubt. Impeachment is a political effort. Would they really have voted to impeach Nixon, and would the Senate really have convicted him? I don't think so. The two major problems, you remember, they were all against him. The press was against him. His ability to govern was the public opinion polls were down. But he was named a co-conspirator because the special prosecutor misrepresented to the grand jury. And the staff recommended impeachment because the special prosecutor misrepresented to the staff. Let me finish with one thing and then we'll go. I worry about this. I fight myself all night long on this. They said Nixon had personally approved the payment of the blackmail. Nixon knew he hadn't. If he had known that was the accusation, Nixon was no quitter. If he had known that was the accusation, he never would have quit. He would have stayed and fought that to the very end because he knew it wasn't true. Now, I'm going to have to stop and go over here.
We have time for two more questions. The first is from this gentleman here.
What does it take for a court to unseal those documents that you referred to earlier?
Funny that you should ask. It's in the book. The answer's in the book, so just read the book. There is a writ, an ancient Anglo-Saxon writ, an appeal to the court called coram nobis. It's roughly writ of error. And the defendant, or if the defendant is dead, the defendant's descendants can come into the court where they were convicted and say, new evidence. We're not re-arguing the case. We could not have discovered this evidence by due diligence at the time, but this new evidence changes everything. The heirs could come in and do that. Now, I deliberately did not discuss that with them leading into the book. They're reading the book for the first time just like you are. I don't know what their reaction is going to be. They've suffered a huge amount already. It would be expensive, be time-consuming, it would be anxiety-filling to come do this. But if I were to do it, if I were one of the descendants and know what I know, I'd come into court and file the petition and say to the court, you go investigate. This isn't my problem, this is your problem. You can get all this information that I can't get. You can put people under oath and I can't do that. And if I could convince the court, then I'd be okay. And the court could direct the Department of Justice. I mean, the court doesn't have to do it. So that's the first step is the descendants could file the writ. It's the same thing on an investigation. That would be, they're the only ones with standing to come into court to ask for an investigation. You asked about the unsealing of the grand jury testimony. When they sought to unseal President Nixon's, I intervened and said, this is unfair, you should never do this. The one thing the president knew. This is after he'd left office. They went and questioned him for 2 days. I said he was sick, he'd lost the presidency. The only thing he knew under this questioning was it would stay sealed forever. And you just can't do that to the man. And besides, I think it was a perjury trap. A perjury trap is where the prosecutor knows they can't charge you for the offense. A statute of limitations, the main witness is dead. So they try to get you to commit a new offense that they can prosecute. And it's kind of a delicious concept. Nixon had been pardoned. The pardon was quite good. They could go ask him in the grand jury to testify about these events. and he could do one of two things. He could sell out his friends, or he could commit perjury and they'd have him, because President Ford did not pardon him for the future. So I entered and filed petitions to no avail. The court ruled against me and released the president's testimony, and we were here, ready to read it, ready to react, and there's nothing there. Turns out that it was a spoof. Well, in the course of my fighting, I amended my petition to say, okay, turnabout's fair play. Let's go release the grand jury stuff on how he got named as a co-conspirator, and that is presently before the court. So, we'll see. We'll see. I think of myself as a Watergate scholar. I'm not a litigating attorney. I'm also not in a position to mount a full-scale attack on this, but you don't have to. You go in, the book will be a huge help, and we'll see what the court does. So we'll see. Now, time for one more question? There you
We have
are.
a question right here.
Sure.
Hi, Mr. Shepard. Thanks for coming out. Two-part question. Number one is, John Dean responded to your book, and number two, was Judge Sirica ever admonished or disciplined for his conduct on the bench following Watergate?
What a delicious question. John Dean and I are not close. John, he did this on my earlier book. He says, well, I haven't had a chance to read it, but Shepard's no good. He's just a lightweight. He was just a kid. I would be happy to meet with John anywhere, but he hasn't read the book, I can promise you. I don't know if he will. I wouldn't if I were John. He's written his best shot, came out last year. It's called The Nixon Defense, and it's John Dean's defense. It's got nothing to do with the president. I wrote a critique about it. It's on my website. I don't know what John will write. I'm eager to hear. I want to get off in the weeds and talk about this stuff. The second question was Sirica. Was Sirica disciplined? Well, no. He was named Time Magazine's Man of the Year. He's a Watergate hero. He was given honorary degrees. So was Archie Cox and Elliot Richardson. They are heroes of Watergate. Now, we'll see. Now, there was a vicious article by Renata Atler, who is a very liberal, great writer. And she wrote a book about the last days of the New Yorker, and she put a sentence in about Judge Sirica that was not pleasing. She said he was corrupt, he was a tool of organized crime, and he was no good. And there was a reaction from the other side, and she got carpet bombed by the New York Times for saying this. So she licked her wounds, and then she published an article in a magazine. It's reproduced later in a book called Canaries in the Mineshaft that just takes Sirica apart and goes through all the stuff and what a terrible judge he was and all this terrible record. And I'm trying to find her. She's something of a recluse, and I can't get her address, but I want to send her my book for free, because it will confirm her worst thoughts about this judge. So I don't think Judge Sirica's reputation can survive this book. This is a direct frontal attack on a judge who is a disgrace to the federal judiciary. And I think that's where the battles are going to be fought, that and with the special prosecutor. Thank you again for coming. This has been really pleasant. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoff. Geoff will be available in the bookstore. In the lobby to sign your books. Books are available to order in the bookstore. Thank you again. Please check back for future events at nixonfoundation.org. Thank you.